What's up? What's up? This is Caffeinate Your Career, a series where I get to ask experts all the questions you want to know. I'm your host, Alicia Josie, and today I'm sitting down with Jeff Torello from CertiPath. Jeff has over 30 years of experience in software engineering, and he has some really good gems that he's going to share with us. So let's get into it. Well, thank you so much for taking time to be with us here today at Caffeinate Your Career. So we're going to start off doing some little rapid get-to-know-you questions.
Yep.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Song that has been stuck in your head lately.
In Your Eyes by Peter Gabriel. It's an old song.
Last movie you watched.
The Matrix trilogy.
Nice.
Because the fourth one's coming out, so.
Okay, how to get prepared.
Yep.
Early bird or night owl?
Yes.
Both. Okay.
Yep. It depends on what's going on, but neither one of those are a problem.
Yeah. And what are you drinking from BU Cafe today?
Cappuccino.
Nice. All right, so let's just get the audience up to speed a little bit. You've been in the engineering industry for about like 25 years now.
Yep,
so
30 years, yep.
Let's start all the way back at the beginning. Can you talk about how you initially got into this industry? Like what got you interested in it?
Well, I've always been a problem solver. So engineering for me was kind of a natural fit personality-wise. I didn't know at the time that there was a thing called engineering. I really just stumbled into it. Liked to take things apart, liked to figure out how they worked. And saw my very first computer and somehow was just enamored, and it captured my attention immediately. And I needed to know how it worked and how I could somehow use it, work with it, play with it, whatever the case may be. But it took years. Actually, I saw that when I was probably in, I think it was 7th grade, and I didn't get near another computer again until the end of high school. At the time I went to high school, computers were not a thing. So I then worked from a job perspective in technical support. And very quickly that just became a computer-based field. And shortly after that I started doing software support and learned about software and thought, oh, okay, now I'm really interested. Now I can tell the computer what to do. Okay, you have me. And things progressed very rapidly from there.
Nice. So it was just kind of a natural progression for you then with your personality.
Yeah, for me, when I describe it, it feels like it just spoke to me. It felt natural to me. It was my interest without even knowing that it was a thing I could go do. And I think that that's very common in a lot of different places. Some folks it might be art. Some folks it might be flying a plane. Whatever. When you don't even think about it because it just speaks to you, that's usually the thing you should find as your passion and go pursue it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Go where the curiosity is.
Yep, agreed.
So you started out your career at Intel Corporation. Can you talk about the roles that you had there? I know you had like 5. So could you give us a little run through?
Yeah, one of the advantages to working for a really big company is that you can change jobs regularly without changing companies. If you work for small companies and you change jobs, usually you have to change companies. And that's okay too, but I didn't know at the time that I would go into Intel and spend 20 years there. I actually, I found myself at Intel as an accident. I had a job in South Florida and was offered a pretty lucrative position if I moved to California. So I did that with my girlfriend, who became my fiance at the time. And 3 months after moving to California, that job fell through, and the gentleman decided, no, I don't want to do this anymore. So I had moved my fiance entirely across the country. No one that we knew lived in within 1,000 miles, and I had lost my job. So it was a very interesting time. So I was applying for everything I could, and I had a person respond to one of the applications and say, hey, you could come here and work tech support, come for an interview. So I went to what I thought was just a corporate building, like an office complex. I didn't know it was an Intel campus. I didn't even know Intel was in the facility or in the neighborhood. I knew who they were, but I didn't expect I'd be working for them. From the very young Jeff perspective, working for Intel's the nirvana of my career. That's the pinnacle of where I'd want to be at that time. I just didn't think that's where I was interviewing. So as I was driving into this interview, thinking it was just a regular tech support job, I kept seeing these signs for Intel, and I kept thinking, oh, Intel must have an office in this office area, and I figured there were plenty of other companies, et cetera, et cetera. I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I finally walked up to the building, and on the outside of the building, it just said Intel, and I thought, oh, they really do have offices here. How cool. Never crossed my mind that I was interviewing for Intel. Walked inside the door, and all the guards were Intel guards, and I finally went, am I interviewing for Intel?
You're like, am I at the right place?
I had absolutely no idea. I was being sent there by an agency as a contractor, so I just, they didn't tell me anything because they didn't need to. At that time, it was no big deal. So I was interviewed by an Intel employee to work there as an Intel support person supporting Intel employees in the Technical Assistance Center is what it was called, the TAC. And the way that model worked at the time, everybody came in as a contractor, and it was a contract for higher position so that they could try everybody out. Things tended to work out, and within 90 days, I was converted to an actual Intel employee. So I started as tech support, just answering the phone and teaching people how to use Windows. This is right around the time that Windows 95 came out, and it was a big deal for people. To put in perspective for the audience, the internet wasn't really a thing when I started working for Intel. It was becoming a thing. But, if you wanted to learn about Windows 95, you went to the bookstore and you bought a book because there were no websites that told you what Windows 95 or what the features were or anything. And now, obviously, you would Google it and you would look at YouTube videos and what have you. Perfect. That's how, things progress. But at this time, that was not how things worked. So it was really a very different time in the world. But I had experience and exposure with the brand new Windows 95 from a prior job, and that was valuable to the team. So I started to progress through following my passion again back to engineering and solving problems. What I quickly got to from technical support was systems engineering, and I started to work for the group that ran Intel's website, or Intel.com. And so I stayed very near the software side of things, very near the internet web side of things, and what at the time was referred to as e-business, what's known as just doing shopping online now.
Yeah, online shopping.
But it was a really big deal when there were no websites and stuff. So I was part of the team that took Intel's first $2 billion over the internet with software that I had helped work on and with servers that I had helped build, etc. It was a really cool time. I also worked on a lot of Y2K stuff, which people may or may not know about, but there was a problem with the way we stored dates in computers prior to 2000. We never used 4 digits, we used 2. So you would store the date as 99 instead of 1999. And that's great, but when you roll over to 2000 and the dates kick over again, some systems were never expected to run that long and they were going to crash. And so there was a huge push between 1998 and 2000 to go fix all those systems. And I actually spent the New Year's Eve Y2K in the data center with a parka on, babysitting about 150 servers to make sure things didn't explode and blow up for Intel.com. And right about 3 a.m. was the end of our 150-person conference call worldwide saying, okay, it looks like we got everything and nothing's broken, so you can all go home now. That's how I spent Y2K New Year's Eve.
Cow. That's awesome. And I know that with TikTok and all these different social media platforms and everything's just so technical now and online, you're probably thinking from such a different perspective. Because for me, I'm 23 and I'm not very tech savvy, but when I look at these things, I'm like, holy cow, the way that we're going in the world is just, it's great, but it's just interesting. So I know that you, having worked in this field and see the progression from, 30 years ago, has to be crazy for you.
I think the biggest thing I could comment on there is the rate of pace of change. And what I mean by that is, I don't have explicit numbers I could rely on from a statistical perspective, but my impression. The amount of time it used to take 30 years ago to make an increase or make an improvement in either software, hardware, what have you. Let's say it used to take 5 years. Over the course of the last 30 years, that window has gotten much smaller. And so we're making changes way faster than we used to. And I honestly think it's really, really difficult for anyone to recognize that from the outside in. Basically, if you're in the middle of that, you talked about TikTok or what have you. There's a really phenomenal article from a blog that I've read for years called Wait But Why. It's a very long form blog, but I recommend folks go look at it if they're interested in technology. And he has a very interesting conversation about if you took a modern individual and you went back in time, let's say 50 years, would it really impress people 50 years ago to see what technology was today? Okay, well, maybe 100 years. So if you went back to 1921, would you blow people's minds with an iPhone or what have you? Sure. But if you went back 500 years from 1921, would you blow people's mind with 1921 technology? Yes. But as you start to go further back, the changes get way smaller. And as you keep going back 500 years, pretty soon folks are like, okay, you're from 500 years in the future. Things look the same. You got a wheel, I got a wheel, that kind of thing. As we roll that back forward, from like 1970 to now is such a tremendous amount of change, and most people can't rationalize that level of change and how fast it's been. For me, what's intriguing is what's the next 10 or 15 years going to look like, and will we be on Mars with Elon Musk and SpaceX? So I'm intrigued of what the new things will be because this pace of change is so fast.
I am intrigued as well. Do you have any predictions?
I have some desires. I don't know if I could call them predictions, but I would like to suggest that if we're careful, we'll probably have really, really powerful AI that's assisting us. If we're not careful, we'll have really powerful AI that doesn't see our purpose very much. And that's all going to come down to who programs it. Because at a certain point, the AI has to be invented before it can become intelligent enough to change itself, right? And we've all seen movies like Terminator and the concept of Skynet, et cetera. But again, it depends on who invents it. So pick the company whose AI you'd want to. Are you an Amazon AI person, an Apple AI person, a Microsoft AI person? And these AIs already exist, right? They're called Alexa and Cortana and Siri. They'll just grow into, I don't know, what will they grow into?
Little robots that are sitting next to us?
Could be. I mean, Amazon just released that a robot that's powered by Alexa, literally in the house.
I have not seen that.
Yeah, with little robotic cameras that fly around the house. I'm not sure what those are supposed to do, but apparently that's good. So I don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, I don't think anybody does. But I seriously think that AI will just continue to influence our lives. I hope it's positive. It would be great to have something like a Tony Stark assistant a Jarvis who could help you out. Wouldn't that be cool, right? Yeah. So that's a positive AI for me, as opposed to a Skynet. But that's one thing. Another for me is space. I'm a big fan of space travel. I think what SpaceX is trying to do in getting us to Mars and building a huge rocket that we need called Starship, et cetera, I think those are really powerful things. And I think the overarching goal there is to try and make life multiplanetary, so that if we are having a climate crisis here that we can't resolve, most people think we are, but maybe not everybody agrees. If that's true, it would be great if we didn't wipe out the species in the process. If we had eventually 1 million people on Mars, maybe that's a second site, a redundancy for the human race. Wouldn't that be neat? Isn't that worth investing in? Isn't that worth pursuing? And by the way, while we're talking about it, think about all the technology and engineering required to get, live, and function on Mars. Not just the rocket, but you got to grow food. You got to do habitats.
Live.
Yeah, you got to do everything, and jobs and mining, and right? It's almost like starting the entire planet over again. You got to bring everything there. You got to make it there.
Yeah.
So the manufacturing industries explode, not like we have today. They have to all come back, right? You got to mine rock. You got to turn into. I'm getting deep, but you get what I mean. So I think that's a huge frontier for us that we should pursue as an entire planet, not just Elon and SpaceX, but everybody. So I'm positive about the future. I think we are able to do really amazing things. We always have in the past. Yes, there's a lot of potential for negativity. There's a lot of potential for negativity all the time. I'm a big believer in a positive attitude helps shape your view. And the more you think positive, the more things happen positive.
Yeah, I think that's a great mindset to have. And whenever you think positive too, you see the positive things. If you're like, oh, this is going to be such a bad day, and then you trip and spill your coffee, you're like, see, it's a terrible day. But if you're like, this is going to be a great day, and something great happens, then you're more likely to see that.
There's an axiom that everything you think and everything you say programs your reality. And it is exactly true if everyone stops for a second and thinks about it. If you think positive, you tend to have a smile and you tend to have a better day. If you say positive, same thing. But if you think negative and you assume the worst, you are molding your reality and you will get what you're thinking about.
I feel like we just got really deep. I just got started thinking really deep. No, thanks for sharing that. I think that's really cool. So going back to the progression of your career, we talked about Intel a little bit. Can you talk about Cree and what it was like being the director of engineering and cybersecurity there?
So Cree was really interesting for me because I left Intel after 20 years, retired, had lots of opportunity left in me and knew I wanted to go do something fun. Had been doing high-level architecture and running a software team when I left Intel. It was a small team, but I had a lot of scope under me, and I was really happy with that situation. So I wanted to find something similar to that. But the job I took at Cree when I started was not as a director. In fact, I didn't have a team at all. I started there to help them build a particular product. And within about 3 or 4 weeks, it became very obvious that they didn't have any idea what they really needed to build this product, and that I could help in a lot of different ways. And within 3 or 4 months, I was a director running a team and built an organization out underneath that. But I used a lot of the existing stuff that I had brought with me from Intel. And what was really sort of eye-opening for me and look back on is obvious, but wasn't obvious at the time, was that I had 20 years of varied experience and exposure to all sorts of things that became this phenomenal baggage that I brought with me with, oh, yeah, I know how to address that problem. Sure, I know what we can do to fix that. And just stuff that I wouldn't have expected or I didn't think about as how to position myself kind of thing. It just became, I had this history and I had this experience, and it was useful in a lot of different ways that I hadn't planned on. And that became part of how I sort of built the organization at Cree. It was mostly, I had a lot of ideas about how I could use agile software development processes to run the team. So instead of just doing a software project with Agile, I thought I could run the people or part of the organization with Agile as well. And what that means is empowering the people to do what they need to do, giving them trust and respect, protecting them from outside influence that they don't need, and giving them a safe space where they can then go do the things that we knew we wanted to do. And there's a philosophy here that's a little strange to hear from a management perspective, but it's true if you take what I mean. Managing people is a lot like raising children. And what I mean by that is, if you raise children with love and respect, and you give them expectations that are reasonable, and they trust you, they will rise to your expectation, whatever that might be. Not because you're making them, but because you think they can, and they believe enough in you to say, well, if he or she thinks I can, maybe I can. Mm-hmm. It's back to this positive attitude. Well, that works 1,000,000% as well with employees. If you're managing a team or you are being managed by a positive manager and they believe in you, why wouldn't you think that you can do whatever they're asking you to do? They think you can. Same concept, right? But I'd never actually put that into practice. I'd always thought about those things and hadn't had the opportunity to completely implement them. At Cree, I did. And I built a phenomenal team that had such fun. We were a blast together. The organization, unfortunately, was in a weird industry where we were having a significant amount of price competitive pressure from China, making product for a lot less money than Cree was able to make product for. And over time, the organization couldn't maintain itself because they couldn't make the money to sustain their existence. But that had nothing to do with what the team and I were working on. Mm-hmm. And I learned so much about how amazing it could be to have a really powerful team. I look back very fondly on my time at Cree.
I like that management perspective, and I like how you mentioned that the things that you did at Intel ended up helping you at Cree, and I want to talk about that a little bit more.
Sure.
So you're now the Vice President of Software Engineering at Certipath.
Right.
What have you taken from working at Intel and Cree that's really helped you in your role today?
Yeah, so I've expanded on the concepts that I've sort of piloted at Cree, mm-hmm. And learned what worked really well. And there's things that I learned at Cree that didn't work great, so I've adjusted those. My whole philosophy is life is just a continual journey of learning. And if you're not learning, you're kind of stagnant and you're probably not happy because things have probably gotten very boring. So I tend to challenge myself all the time. I read a tremendous amount. Most of the people who know me refer to me as a bibliophile. I read a lot, sometimes 5 books a week. Crazy.
Holy cow.
Yeah, I read very fast. I read a lot. I retain a tremendous amount of what I read. Just because I've always done that, and it's just almost a training thing. I read all sorts of different things. I read pleasure books. I read sci-fi stuff, but I also read books in the industry. I'm actually in the process of writing a book about how to manage in the industry, but that's another topic. But I try to consume as much information as I can and use that information in practice and say, okay, well, it seems like this works for folks. Well, let me try that with the team. Let me see if the team wants to give that a whirl. Also, really refined from Intel knowledge, but also experience at Cree, how I go about helping the team tackle problems. As a leader, one of the things that I believe is the reason we exist is to remove roadblocks for the folks that are doing the work. As a manager, I'm no longer writing code. The people that work for me write code. So my job is to do everything I can to get things out of their way so they can write code or test code or whatever, right? So I mentioned before about kind of insulating the team from others. In any company, there are folks who want to know what's going on or want to know if you can help with something, et cetera. If they go directly to the team, it's very easy to interrupt what's known as flow with respect to development. And it can sometimes take hours to get somebody back to the point where they were just writing that if-then statement, as an example, right? So it looks weird from the outside, but part of what I do is help the team insulate by either myself or one of our product owners being the point of contact for everybody else in the organization. If you need something from the team, we are happy to help. Please come to us and ask, and we will figure out who the right person is for that request, and we'll figure out when the right time is for them to be interrupted, and we'll get you what you need. We'll do it for you fast. Just don't go direct, because it will really mess things up. And that was a cool thing to figure out and be able to teach all of Certipath about, which they recognize and respect really well, because every time they come to us, they get what they want super fast, because we're able to prioritize it, fit it in the right model, and make sure we're not interrupting the right things. And that was a big key learning for me from Cree, because at Cree, I didn't have that level of control, and the team was getting pulled in different directions all the time, and it was counterproductive to a lot of stuff. So that was a big deal for me to figure out.
Nice. And so now your title has software engineering in it, and previously you were engineering and you were the director of engineering and cybersecurity. So can you talk about cybersecurity versus software engineering? Is it one and the same, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I still do a tremendous amount of cybersecurity. It's just not in the title at the moment, but it's still a fantastic question. So cybersecurity encompasses a lot of things. It could be as simple as, are you using the same password on multiple websites? Don't answer the question, because I know you are, because everybody is. Are you using a password manager to help you create strong passwords so you don't have to remember all those passwords and instead keep yourself safer? No, but should you? Yes. And when you're done listening to this, should you go figure out what a password manager is? Please do. But that's personal cybersecurity, and it's still super valuable, right? You don't want your bank information compromised. But let me tell you a secret. I don't need your bank information to compromise your bank. Do you know what I need? Your email. You know why?
You hack my email, and there's emails in there.
All I have to do is, you're very close, but let me explain. If I can get into your Gmail account, then I can look in your history and see that you use Wells Fargo. Then I can go to Wells Fargo, type in your Gmail account and say, password reset, please, and I now own your bank account. And I didn't have to do anything with your bank. So if your Gmail password is not super secure and you're listening to me right now, you should be scared. Go make your password safe. And turn on two-factor authentication, which get a text message or whatever. Your Gmail account is one of the big Achilles heels in personal cybersecurity, and no one ever thinks about it. I know you're all thinking about it right now. Good, I did my job. So cybersecurity from the perspective of corporate is, I'm writing software applications. Are they safe? Do they keep the users safe? Do they not leak data? Do they not expose information they shouldn't? Are they using encryption, et cetera? Okay, that's one facet of it. Are we developing securely? Are we using secure coding practices to make the software be as safe as possible? That doesn't just mean insulate from bugs. There's always bugs. That's fine. It is a thing. It's just what you do. You fix them when you find them. But when there's a bug, do we fail safe so that the software doesn't open itself up just because there's a bug? Those sorts of things. And then also, are we making sure that our customers can consume our software and recognize that it is actually safe and signed and secure, as opposed to just any random piece of software floating out there that looks like us? Those are all things that are involved with cybersecurity. Also, architecture. Am I doing things the right way? If I've got to have two different systems talk to each other, there's definitely a right way to do that that's safe and a wrong way to do that that's not safe. Which way are we doing it? And how, every time we want to do something like that, can we make sure we're doing it safely? You're asked, is it different? Is there a difference between cybersecurity and software? And I want to answer you with no, because if you're doing software and you're not doing it safely with cybersecurity in mind, you're not doing software. You're doing something wrong. in my opinion.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Makes sense. How would you say the field has changed since you began your career? I know that you talked a little bit about, just how fast technology is changing, but is there anything else that you wanted to mention?
Well, I'll say this. As I mentioned when we first talked about Intel and like Windows 95, connectivity is now ubiquitous, but it wasn't in the past. And so there's a big security implication to that. If you wrote software many years ago and you knew it was just going to sit on one computer and that would be it, then you would take completely different risks or chances, if you will. Now that every computer can be connected at any moment in time, and usually is, and that the thing in your hand that is called a phone but you hardly ever make phone calls with is actually just a computer, right? Which most people don't seem to internalize. They call it a phone. In my history, phones are what you talk on, and everything else is done with a computer, but it's okay. We can use whatever language we want. But that is also a difference in the world itself, but from the perspective of things that have changed, even in let's say the last 15 years, at one point in time you would Google something, and now you just ask your phone, and it may or may not use Google, and you don't really care. In fact, Google's become a verb, right? Mm-hmm. Not just a proper name.
Googling something.
Exactly, right. But if you're Binging something, okay, that's still a search engine. It's run by Microsoft instead of by Google. But if the phone's using that as its search backend, which you don't really care about as long as you get the results you want. Same with mapping, whether it's Apple Maps or it's MapQuest or it's Google Maps, right? What I'm seeing is a continual abstraction of the detail. Is what I'm trying to get to answer your question. So people are less concerned about the specifics. Am I Googling something? As opposed to, am I getting the information from somewhere and do I care where? And that has positives and negatives. For me, the positive is it removes a lot of friction. Again, in the past, you'd have to open up your phone and go to Google's website and type in your search query. Then you could ask it, you could voice ask it, whether it's Siri or what have you. If you voice ask it, you don't know where it's getting the data from. Great, it's way frictionless. You don't have to type anything. It's faster, but can you trust the information? Because you don't know where it's coming from. And even if you do know where it's coming from, can you trust it? Should you trust it? I can't answer those questions, but I think people should be asking those questions. Mm-hmm. And also, if you are trusting it, should you know whether or not it's accurate? We can have a conversation about vaccines or masks, and I can suggest to you that there's information in both positive and negative sides of that conversation available for you to, we'll use the phrase Google, but what's the validity of the source of that information? So for me, the bigger overall conversation is, as we abstract more and we make things easier and frictionless for folks, are we also abstracting out some of the validity of source material and the ability for us to know whether we should trust something? And I think that we are doing that, and we should probably question whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah. That's interesting because I do use my Siri sometimes.
Sure.
And I actually don't even think about where the information's coming from. But when I Google something, I'll be like, oh, this site looks a little sketchy. Like, let me find a different site to check the answer for.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I will be thinking, you're leaving me with a lot of things to think about after this conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about what a day or a week in your role is like.
Okay. One of the things that's really valuable to me, CertaPath's a relatively small company, around about 50 people. So the whole VP of software engineering sounds fantastic, but it's a relatively small team. It's not the same thing as like a VP at Intel. However, the end up result of what I do is very, very similar. The thing that I like about being at a small company is that the work changes a lot. We're not working on the same software products, right? But sometimes I'm talking to customers and getting feedback and information about requirements and features they want in the future. Sometimes I'm sitting with the team working on architecture. How are we going to implement a particular feature? What's the best way to do it? What's the secure way to do it? Sometimes I'm sitting with employees working on personal things to help them with stuff. All of that happens in the same day or week. Mm-hmm. It's a big, wide scope, and that's part of what makes it fun and entertaining. So, for example, this week We started out the week. I have my staff meetings on Mondays. I like to try and have staff at the beginning of the week and set the tone for the week. Yep. Here's what we're going to work on. We do a little review for the week before, but not a large portion of what we do. Also, like I'm going to travel next week, so I let the team know that I won't be around for a couple days, and if they need me, here's how they can get a hold of me while I'm traveling. Basic communication stuff. And then the team goes off and starts to do what they need to do. I get pulled in where needed, as they need me. The way I run the organization, it's this concept of an open door where if they have something for me, they don't have to wait, they don't have to schedule it, they can just hit me up, whether it's in Slack or a text or whatever they need. If I'm in the middle of something, I'll tell them that. I'll get back to them as soon as I can. They've figured out that I return my messages, so they're fine with that structure. And from a software engineering perspective, if a developer's in the middle of something and they have a question, and they can't go forward without the answer to that question, it can be very jarring. Also, their productivity, takes a dive. So you want to try and answer those questions as soon as you can. I like to make sure when possible that I have someone else available. In this case, it's the product owner that is able to try and answer as many questions as I can wherever possible. So if I'm not available, someone else is, and he or she can try to address that question. I want to keep the developers moving forward. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I can't. It's just the way it is, but I structure things to try and make that be as small a problem as possible. We had this interview scheduled, so I did a little prep work to make sure I could answer questions, that looked over the questions to make sure I had a clue what you were going to talk about, so that I would sound somewhat intelligent. But also, I had a lunch engagement because we're looking at potentially moving spaces, and I need to figure out what space are we going to take. We're not all working in the office anymore. We're working remotely a lot, but I still want some sort of office space for occasional things. I don't need it to be as big as I have today, so I'm looking at downsizing. What am I going to actually put in that space? I need to figure out who's going to help move all the equipment, so I've started talking to people to do that. That's all so far this week. We're only at Wednesday. I've got a big planning meeting scheduled tomorrow because we're ending a 2-week sprint cycle and we're starting a new one. We have a whole new set of stories and a new set of features that we're going to be working on, and I need to review that and make sure I understand what features we're going to go after. I need to ask the questions I want to ask on certain features, and so I have to do some review for that. So I have to set time aside on my calendar to make sure that I get that done and don't let the team wait for that. And then on Friday, I've got to start working on planning whatever we're going to do for this year's Christmas, because we're not going to put a whole party together with everybody's spouses, etc. We're going to do a small thing in the office for just the folks that want to come in that feel safe to do that. But I still have to figure out what that's going to look like, and I'm going to have to start calling caterers or whatever. None of those sound like software engineering, but that's part of what the job is, right? Yeah. It's all over the place. So please ask details about any of those pieces in there. I gave you a pretty wide scope, but that's part of what the job is. When you get to a certain level, it's almost everything, right? It's not just one thing.
What would you say whenever you were working some of your first jobs at Intel, your time was spent like? So was it a lot of stuff like just on the computers, or did you have a lot of like face-to-face interactions with your teammates and your managers?
Yeah, I was about to fall, sorry.
This paper's so slick.
When I first started at Intel, the vast majority of my day was spent either on a phone, talking to people for tech support, or on a computer, typing in information, looking up information as that started to be a thing. And it was very much doing my work myself, interacting with my team whenever necessary, attending meetings when necessary, but it was a lot of, we'll call it individual contributor work. As you move forward over a career, when you are only responsible for yourself, the work is pretty much centered around what you do and what you need to do. And if a peer or a boss asks for something, you give them what they need. As you move up the ladder and you become responsible for others, your tasking changes to doing what your upper level management needs you to do, and figuring out what your folks that you're taking care of need from you to do their job. But also, there's a lot of planning and a lot of forward-looking thought, because in order to keep your team occupied and busy, you're not just going to show up on Monday and figure that out. And if you do, you're not doing it right. You need to plan that and think it through and decide who's the right person for this task versus that task, and give the right things to the right people so that they're successful at it, so that the work comes back the way it needs to be done. All of that takes a lot of forethought and planning, and that's not something you see looking up when you start, and it is something you hopefully learn quickly as you move up the role structure, so that you can be successful at it, right?
Yeah. And what are some challenges that you often face in this field?
Well, one of the things that is, for me, is intriguing but can be a challenge is that back to this rate of pace of change. How you write software has changed so dramatically in 30 years, in 20 years, in 10 years, even in 5 years, that you have got to keep up continually. And if you don't, you'll very quickly fall behind and in some cases be very hard to get another job because your technology skills have waned. So continual learning, keeping up to speed every single year, there's an improvement or an upgrade in the language you're using, the tech stack you're using, the technology you're going after, whether it's crypto or it doesn't matter. If you aren't continuing to learn and keep up to speed, you can't continue to compete with your peers. But also, as the technology improves, again, this concept of abstraction, you may be working down here at an older level and you're taking way longer to do something than the new abstracted layer gives you the ability to be faster at. And now what will happen is your performance will suffer and you may be graded against peers who are working at the new abstraction layer. So you've got to compete constantly. It's a never-ending cycle.
So if people are interested in this field, they should be lifelong learners, pretty much.
If you're not a lifelong learner, I don't think you'll be successful at anything. In this field, it's absolutely required. Think of it like a treadmill, and as you're in this job longer, the treadmill just gets faster.
Wow. And what would you say that you love the most about working in software engineering, cybersecurity?
I do like that. I told you the concept of the rapid change. I do like that there's always a challenge. And in this particular case, we're working on a product that is consumed by customers. What that means is instead of us deciding what capabilities we need, the customers do. And that's probably the most entertaining part of the job because different customers need different things. And every time a new customer requirement shows up, it's a new challenge. It's a new thing to go figure out. And that's pretty much what I have always loved in my life is solving the problem, figuring out the challenge, doing the engineering. Now, I may not hands-on do as much of the engineering as I used to, but I still talk with the team about it, and we still talk about the approach, and we still decide the best way to go about it, and I give them guidance where I can, and that's still fun. And for me, that's the biggest entertaining piece of it.
Yeah. All right, so I want to shift a little bit to talk about the route for young adults who know that they want to get into this field. So let's say that I was a high school student and I wanted to get into engineering. How would you say I should start developing my skills?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. My opinion is if you're an engineer, you probably already know, not necessarily because you already have the training, but because you already think a particular way, you're already one of my favorite authors, Stephen King, described why he writes horror versus romance as a sink strainer that everybody has, and as information comes into your brain, whatever sits in the strainer is the thing you're interested in, and whatever falls through is the thing you're not. And usually what's in the strainer is your passion. For me, solving problems or being an engineer or being a nerd or whatever is what sits in my filter, if you'll take that analogy. If you're already that type of person, you probably have already decided you're interested in these certain things, and they speak to you. And that's what makes you really good at it. So I do strongly believe in the concept of follow your passion. And if you haven't found your passion yet, okay, do all kinds of things to go expose yourself to stuff and find your passion. Once you've found your passion, then there's probably a lot of different ways to pursue it. And I don't think that there's a right or a wrong. So let's talk about a couple ways. You can do the traditional thing and go down the schooling route and follow the course curriculum for a degree in XYZ. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. And there's plenty of people who are super successful with that. That wasn't the path that I ended up taking in the beginning. I went a different way because different things were speaking to me at the time, especially right out of high school. So I'm mostly self-taught. Career-wise, I have a degree that I actually achieved after I started working for Intel. Intel helped me get that degree and paid for it.
Oh, that's nice.
It was very nice and very helpful from the perspective of where I was coming from. But even with that degree, the vast majority of what I've done in my life has been things that I've read on my own and I've done on my own and I've developed on my own. I happen to be one of those nerds that's just a self-taught. Things just seem to speak to me in certain cases, and when they do, I go research the craziness out of them and learn them. I also do consume the written word very well, and I'm hands-on, but I can look at something, read it, and immediately understand it, and go forward using it. And that's not something everyone can do. Some folks need to actually either write the code or play with the computer pieces or whatever the case may be, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with hands-on learning too. In fact, both of them are even better. So I want to try and answer your question, but I'm being vague because I think that there's a very large scope to this answer from my point of view. If you go to school to pursue your career, I really strongly recommend you take all sorts of wild, crazy classes. Just because you're in school for engineering, take a pottery class. Expose yourself to other things. I will tell you that you may not realize it at the time, but you will learn something everywhere, and it can be applied anywhere if you're open enough to it. And you go take an art class or a pottery class or a music class or anything that is creative. And by the way, let's talk about how creative programming is, but we can get to that, but it is really just as creative. You'll be able to use the concepts you learn there for writing code. It may not seem like you can in the beginning, but trust me, you absolutely can. I'll give you a simple example. If anyone out there writes code, they'll understand this statement. Anyone who doesn't may not get it, but it makes sense. I can recognize a programmer's signature by looking at the code they write, in the same way that someone can recognize the brushstrokes of a Picasso. Okay, it is that distinct. It is a style, it is a technique, it is an approach. It's how your brain works. And the more you expose yourself to other ideas and other potential inputs, the more varied your approach will be, and the more creative a programmer you would end up being. So I don't think that an engineer needs to only be an engineer and never be anything but an engineer. I don't believe with that at all. I think you got to be an engineer who's also majored in dance.
Right.
Why not?
We're multifaceted, so why not, you
Right.
know, explore different things and introduce that diversity in.
Yeah, agreed. And at the same time, there are some people who are just never going to do anything but engineering, and that's just who they are. Okay, fine too.
Yeah.
Some people who are just never going to do anything but pottery. Okay, fine too. I don't have a problem with any of that. I'm much more about pursue your passion.
Right.
You'll be better at it, you'll be happier, and you'll probably make more money, because when you're pursuing your passion, you're not working. You're doing the thing you love, and when you do the thing you love, it's just natural, right?
Yeah. I love what you mentioned too about the previous jobs or not jobs. I love how you mentioned about the previous classes that people would take and how it can relate somehow, some way in their career. Because I found that to be true for myself. Like, I remember in high school, I had like a job at a restaurant and I was like, I never want to do this. And now I'm like, my fast pace, like the pace that I work at is probably because of my experience working in restaurants. So
yeah.
I love that you mentioned that. So when I did a little bit of Google searching about software engineering, I see a bunch of things come up saying like, take this boot camp, coding boot camp.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those? What's your take on that?
Well, I'll say this. I'm a fan of learning, period. If it looks like a boot camp is going to be valuable to you and it's not a foolish expense that puts you in some sort of weird position, it may be okay. But also, before you pursue the boot camp, look for free training for the same exact thing. Sometimes you can find as simple as a YouTube video, that'll teach you the latest Python thing, and you don't need the 7-day boot camp. Maybe the boot camp would help you and learn more, but also, especially if it costs money, maybe you don't need 7 days of it. Maybe the thing you're looking for at the moment is to learn enough about Python to go, Python's the tool that'll help me, or this won't help me. Wouldn't it be cool to learn that in an hour-long YouTube video versus 7 days? So look for alternatives, look for open source or free versions of what you're trying to do first. I'm not against the concept of paying for it. I also think, depending on who you are, if it was me and I was trying to learn a new language or new technology, I would go do it myself, and I will learn it way better. I will remember a lot more. I won't probably get as much out of a 7-day structured thing because it'll take too long, right? I move at a much faster pace. I need much more condensed information. And also, in my instance, I have an advantage, but I know about 14 programming languages. At a certain point, programming languages are just syntax. The structure of programming is just the concept of logic and flow and things of that nature. Once you know that, all the languages are now just syntactical differences. And so learning a new language for me is relatively easy because it's generally the same effective approach. In that case, I wouldn't spend 7 days on a technology because I'll never need 7 days.
Right.
But I have an advantage that not everybody has, right? But still, I think you can go and figure it out on your own faster. Even if it's, go create a virtual machine, play around with it, crash it, destroy it, delete it, do it again. You're learning every single time you do that. The key thing I want people to hear is there's no such thing as a mistake if you learn from it.
Right.
It's just called learning. The only time it's a mistake is if you didn't learn and you did it again. Now you're making mistakes. But if you screw something up, but you learned a lesson from it, and now we'll take that lesson forward and be better the next time, that's not a mistake.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people call that failure, but it's not. It's like failure is if you completely just stop and give up on it.
Failure is if you don't learn. That's all. Right? You have to make mistakes. In fact, if anyone sits down for a minute and thinks really hard about it, the things you learned the most, the biggest things you ever learned, were big mistakes. Big mistakes. Whether that was a relationship, right? When you figure out you're with the wrong person and you go through the pain of that and you get rid of it, you learned a lot. And you won't make that one again, generally.
Yeah.
Right? That's a mistake, but boy, if you learned it, good. That stays with you forever. Same with whether it's a programming mistake or a driving mistake or any of those. As long as you're learning from it, it's not a negative.
That's all that matters. So you mentioned some programming, some programs. What programming languages do you suggest students focus on learning when just starting out to just kind of have that foundation?
Interesting question. If they're doing self-taught, I'd like them to learn a language that's relatively easy to consume. So I would probably pick Python. If they're in a structured program and they're teaching Java or they're teaching C, those are great. Nothing wrong with it. But I would also look at the real world and see that there is probably less call today for new Java programmers than there are, Python or JavaScript. By the way, Java and JavaScript are not the same thing. So for those that don't understand that, JavaScript's a different language. Those are much more popular. There's a new language called Golang out there. There's a bunch of languages like Rust, etc. What I really want to get across to folks listening is the language isn't the key. It's the concept of programming and the overall structure of how you go about that. Learn that general concept with any language, and then go learn more languages and realize very quickly that languages are just tools in a toolbox. And if you take that mentality, pick up the toolbox and say, okay, well, I need to turn a screw. Let me use a screwdriver because a hammer is not going to be as effective. Which language is the right language for this particular screw? Use that.
Right.
And if you have a variety of languages in your toolbox because you understand that languages are really about syntax and the concept of programming is an art itself, then you can use any tool you need. And that's the value I want people to hear.
Yeah, that's a good point. How important are certifications?
Well, I wouldn't jump on certifications just starting out. And here's the reason why. As a hiring manager, I'll say, if I'm looking at someone, let's say a new college graduate, right, who maybe has 1 or 2 internships but is pretty green, and they've got 12 certifications, they really don't know much. They've certainly not put any of those certifications to use. So they might be valuable, but I won't see that as a very big positive. I'll see that as a person who likes to take tests. Okay, cool. What I'd rather see is someone who went and tried to find jobs or did stuff on their own related to those certifications to be real world with them and is pursuing certifications that seem valuable to them slowly, as necessary, not to just fill their resume with letters.
Yeah, to just have something.
Right. Now, that being said, certifications are valuable because they do teach you some really concise and condensed information at times. But again, for me, it's more case by case. Right.
Okay. Good to know. And lastly, is there something that you wish you knew early on in your career? Something that maybe you could share with them as they're starting out?
We've talked about it already, but I think the biggest things that I would have loved to have internalized better earlier, would have made me better, is the concept of mistakes are learning, and that I was going to be a lifelong learner. So just continue to learn. Don't ever think I don't need to. Just get in it. Just do it. If I had internalized that younger, I'd probably be even more successful. And then the other one is the passion concept, which just do the things that you like doing, right? If you're in a job and you just do not like the job, change. I know it seems daunting and, how am I going to pay my rent? just get another job. Just do it. Don't be afraid of it. Make the change. Everything will be better if you're not in a job you're unhappy with.
Yeah, that's
as painful
really
as that
advice.
sounds in the beginning. Right? Don't just quit your job and have your parents freak out at me.
Yeah,
right?
and have no plan.
Right, find a new job,
Yeah,
but just actively go get the job. Don't stay in a job you don't like.
Right.
There's no value.
Yeah. Did you want to talk a little bit more about how programming is creative? I know you mentioned it earlier.
Oh, yeah. So we talked a little bit about how I can recognize a developer's signature, just like a brushstroke. People think that programming is, we'll call it right-brained, even though it's not an accurate statement, but we'll just use that. And it's all about logic, but it's not. It's actually one of the most creative parts of computing. And what I mean by that is, if I'm trying to solve a problem with code, there are an infinite number of ways I can solve that problem. It is absolutely not a single solution at any time. How I solve that problem is where the creativity comes into play. As an example, all of my team I give them Legos and Play-Doh. They're all adults. It has nothing to do with the toys being toys. There's a lot of creative research that suggests that if you're trying to solve a problem and you're struggling with it, or you're wrestling with how do I can go this way, I can go that way, etc. If I give you a manipulative and I give you time to just mess around with it, whether you're playing with Play-Doh, you're building a Lego thing or whatever, you will actively still be thinking about the problem, but you'll be focusing forefront on the Lego and putting things together. And you'll be sitting in the background processing and creating solutions to that particular problem. And you might stop the Lego in the middle and go, oh, wait, let me just do that. And I can't tell you how many times I've watched that happen with the teams over years, because it is absolutely valuable. I actually put small boxes of Lego kits, little like 60-piece Lego kits, in all the conference rooms at Cree on the floor that my team was on. So anytime we were in a meeting, they could
grab it and
be creative and constructive. And while they were doing that, they were solving other problems without recognizing that they were actually solving problems, which for me is part of creativity. And it's just, to me, it's exactly the same way that I think someone would create a painting or a portrait or a sculpture. They're just being creative. You're actually using both sides of your brain. I don't even agree with the whole sides of the brain conversation. I think you use both sides all the time. But to say that programmers are right brain or logic only is not accurate, and I can prove it, and I've proved it for years.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to say.
That's really interesting, because I thought that you were like giving a metaphor, like Play-Doh, Legos. No, you meant literal Play-Doh and Legos. Mm-hmm. But that makes sense. I mean, you're kind of taking your mind off of it, but you're not. So It makes sense.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so now we're going to do the final 3. It's just going to be like the rapid questions. Do you remember them?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so for this one, we're going to just try and make it a little dynamic. So I'm going to ask questions over here, but if you can just look at this camera.
Sure.
As if
No
you're
problem.
talking to them.
All right.
Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to leave the audience with some things. Something for them to read or watch.
There's a really good book by Neil Stephenson called 7 Eves that I highly recommend.
A topic for them to research deeper in the industry.
There's something called zero trust architecture. That's a bit of programming and a bit of cybersecurity. Super interesting.
And lastly, a final piece of advice for them on their journey.
Always keep learning, no matter what. Even mistakes are learning.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really enjoyed sitting down with Jeff. And if you did enjoy this, please subscribe down below. And we will see you guys next month on Caffeinate Your Career. Have a wonderful day.